We come now to the final session of the Center's Symposium on the Palestinians' New Directions, the closing address by Professor Idwārd Saʿīd of Columbia University. Professor Said will be known to everybody here as the author of the path-breaking work Orientalism that has reoriented critical thinking about the Middle East. And many of you will know of his numerous other scholarly accomplishments. His other major books of interest, particularly to us here today, The Question of Palestine, Covering Islam, articles that have appeared in many important journals, newspapers around the world. Idwārd Said has a new book coming out in the fall, Culture and Imperialism, which will be published by Alfred A. Knopf. And he tells me that he's got a busy schedule ahead of him. Next week he'll be going to the University of California at Irvine to give the Renee Wellick Library Lectures in Critical Theory, which has to do with music, another one of Edward's many interests. He'll be giving the George Antonius Annual Lecture at Oxford in June. And next November, he will be going to London to give the first Raymond Williams Memorial Lecture in Criticism. We're very pleased. It's very fitting, I think, that Idwārd Said should close this symposium. After he finishes his prepared remarks, we'll have about 10 minutes for questions and comments, as usual, before we adjourn. Idwārd Said.
Thank you very much, Michael Hudson. Can you hear? Is this all right? Is this better? No, I don't think this is working. I'm very grateful to you for your warm introduction, and I'd like publicly to apologize, to abase myself before you for not having had the courtesy to attend the first day of the conference because of a very much predetermined series of exams at Columbia. It's the end of the year for us now, and I couldn't get away yesterday. So I'm sure I've missed, judging from the remarks and papers given today at the several panels that I attended, I'm sure I missed a great deal of useful and illuminating comment. I say this also by way of preparing you for what may in fact be a series of disappointments. That is, I think at this date, given the utterly justifiable amount of comment, criticism, adulation, appreciation, analysis of the Palestinian uprising, it may now be almost impossible to say anything new. It may be almost impossible to say anything beyond a repetition of what has been said. So what I want to talk about today, not only about the Intifada, but about the things that it seemed to me concern Palestinians, should be taken more in the nature of, should be considered more in the nature of a few glosses, a few marginal comments on the themes that have been so aptly and so ably prepared for in the comments at this conference and all the preceding ones that have dealt with the Palestinian situation. A series of comments and perhaps inflections, underlinings, accentuations, and so on and so forth. I think, to begin, that it's now clear that the Palestinian situation as represented by the Intifada on the West Bank and Gaza is distinctive in all sorts of ways, but principally in terms of its innovative and imaginative and creative forms of resistance to the Israeli occupation. The Intifada therefore presents a series of challenges to everyone concerned, including those Palestinians who, in the midst of resistance, in the midst of finding new and imaginative ways to get around the system of humiliations, harassments, blockages imposed by the Israelis, have done things that I think have surprised even them. And I would say then that the principal motif of the current moment, indeed of the whole experience, which is irreversible, of the Intifada, is that it has presented to everyone, including Palestinians, a series of challenges, a series of provocations to somehow make sense of it, to somehow hold on to its forward and propulsive energy, to try, in other words, to harness it. Now, it seems to me quite clear, for instance, and everyone has said this, that the momentous political developments on the Palestinian scene internationally, that is to say, beginning with the Palestinian National Council meetings in Algeria in mid-November and continuing through December and on into the meeting of Yasser Arafat with Mitterrand of France earlier this week, those events, it seemed to me, are political attempts to make the energy of the Intifada work for a Palestinian political goal, which is, of course, independence and self-determination. So it's an attempt of the institutions of the Palestinian political body to somehow take charge of, to capitalize on, it's entirely reasonable and just to do so, to capitalize on this forward energy and to compel it into a coherent political program, which is, of course, self-determination and independence. The Israeli response to it, officially, has been in dramatic contrast, obviously, to kill it. And one of the interesting things, I think, of note in recent Israeli press comment that I've seen is that the Israelis are now beginning to concede that the attempts to destroy the Intifada officially by repression, the use of the army, through the use of propaganda techniques designed partly under the influence of the revered Dr. Kissinger to marginalize it, have failed. There's an interesting piece in one of the in Haaretz by a leading Israeli commentator that I saw, a translation of it, Yoel Marcus, which is entitled Tom and Jerry. And the substance of the article is that what's going on the West Bank and Gaza is a replay, a kind of real-life replay of the Tom and Jerry cartoons in which Tom the cat, much larger, bigger, more powerful, more vicious, the mouse, but Jerry the mouse always finds ways to elude him, and of course the scenario continues to unfold. And the examples he gives are interesting to me. I hadn't heard them before. He said, for example, at one point the occupation authorities tried to stop the use of burning rubber tires, and requisitioned them all, whereupon Palestinians, 15,000 tires were found and were used as flower pots. So, and that's very difficult to deal with. The phones are cut off on the West Bank and Gaza. People then go, he says, to Israel to make phone calls. I mean, it makes sense. And so on and so forth. So there's a constant series of these things. He says, in the end, and the conclusion of the article, which I think has a certain racist tinge to it, nevertheless suggests that finally, he says, the Jewish brain, I'm quoting, the Jewish brain has been defeated. So, I mean, I think there's that sense in which the extraordinary resourcefulness, which is amazing to people like myself who have heard and watch, of course, and follow with great interest the Intifada, it seems to be never-ending, and one can therefore prophesy that it will continue to go on. But along with that, as another comment by another Israeli journalist suggests, has been a a political and psychological campaign to delegitimize and dehumanize the Palestinian intifada by a series of first simple dehumanizations, you know, the reference to grasshoppers, cockroaches, all of those epithets. Secondly, the treatment of the Palestinians as a deviating group, that is to say, as a group of psychopaths, rioters, thieves, and terrorists. Third, to provide the Palestinian intifada through the press, through the media, through government discourse, with a series of extremely negative characteristics, such as referring to them as parasites, aggressive, etc., connoting the most evil and the worst kinds of dehumanizing adjectives to them. Fourthly, to represent them as representing evil and a general danger to society. I'm more or less quoting here, referring to them as fascists, Nazis, and so on and so forth. And fifth is to compare them to the Palestinians to ethnic and historical groups that symbolize evils like the Huns, the Vandals, the barbarians, and so on and so forth. So all of this is also going on. As against which, I return now once again to the theme of the Intifada, another series of comments by an Israeli journalist in which the Intifada appears as a kind of constant educational effort on the part of Palestinians to educate themselves in an independent way, away from dependence upon the Israeli system and indeed on the occupation regime. So that what you have is the impression of the West Bank and Gaza as a vast self-teaching apparatus in which people teach themselves, since the schools are closed, the schools and universities are closed, teach themselves in underground or in private groups. Agriculture, which is officially supervised, sequestered, dominated by the Israelis, is carried on in back gardens and so on and so forth. There are, of course, important changes within Israeli society. Those have to be noted, positively responding to the tremendous outburst of resistance and new thought in the Intifada. But by and large, it is, of course, the frozen quality of the Israeli official response that is dramatically in opposition to this, as I say, creativity and innovation provided by the Intifada, and indeed by the attempts by the Palestinians to harness this energy to creative and positive ends. Since we are, I come now to the second point I wanted to note, since we are, all of us here, or most of us here, in the United States, it therefore is requisite to look at the effects of the Intifada at this moment in the United States. And there, I think the answer could be given quite simply. There is a tremendous and even dramatic change in popular opinion, as reflected in all kinds of experiences, personal, public, having to do with opinion polls and so on and so forth, that suggest that a seismic change is occurring in American society on the question of Palestine and on representations of the Palestinians, their political aspirations, the image, and so on and so forth, which are truly dramatic. Of course, there are other things that are at work here, not so positive. That is to say, there's an attention span which has now been institutionalized by the networks, which is roughly about 13 seconds. So that since the focus on the Middle East is not perpetual, is not as it is for Palestinians, as it is for us, there is then the natural erosion in this changed and positive image. But we can come back to that perhaps later. But for the most part, I want to note something that has been most, in my opinion, brilliantly analyzed by a journalist whom I haven't read, because I'm coming to the media in a second. That is to say, whom I've not met, rather, a man called Donald Neff, who strikes me as of the people who write regularly in this country on the Middle East, strikes me as by far the most interesting and perspicacious and often brilliant. In an article he did in Middle East International, in which he talks about the calculated ambiguity of the official American position. And what I heard of the remarks made by some underling in the State Department yesterday here strike me as more of the same. I think it's an utter disgrace that this recycled pablum which passes for policy, which is in fact, you know, kind of the most tired and mindless hypocrisy, is still tolerated as public discussion on the Middle East by the government. I think one ought to therefore note the almost total degradation of public discourse on the Middle East by policymakers in the universities, in various institutes and institutions, if you'll pardon the pun, brooking no thought, where thinking about the Middle East is almost totally devoid of the slightest bit of daring, the slightest bit of attempting to respond to a situation which is, as I said a moment ago, dramatically unfolding in ways that obviously outstrip most of our efforts to understand and assess it, but certainly many of us make the effort. But one of the things that is puzzling in the extreme to me is to hear the Secretary of State, for example, in his vehement opposition to the moral crimes of the PLO daring to want to get into WHO, and saying that the United States firmly opposes it without a trace of any justification, without any attempt to understand the tremendous national need for such an admission of the PLO to WHO, and the continued, I would say, criminal abuse of the United Nations as a forum for, not for attacking Israel, but for defending Israel shamelessly by the United States. Here I would like to refer to another recent publication that the Journal of Palestine Studies, which I only got yesterday, and it's quite an interesting article by a jurist or a lawyer called Mark Cohen, which talks about complicity, and the complicity of the United States. And I think there the concept is a useful one and ought to be used more often. That is to say, we as American citizens ought to be more aware of the extent to which and register our disapproval in the strongest terms of the extent to which our government, our represented and elected officials are in actual complicity with the most unattractive and criminal acts against Palestinians. The killings, one example of which, the most recent of which, is horrific, the Nahalim killings of last month. The endless series of administrative and military measures taken against Palestinian civilians who, I think from the age of about 4 on, are subject to the whims of settlers and soldiers who have their own problems. I'm not trying to suggest that we're dealing with criminals exclusively, but the fact is that the massive attacks on Palestinians and the abrogation of the most elementary forms of human rights are in fact supported by the United States. And I think the finger pointing is very much in need now, and although it's very difficult in the present circumstances to do that, given the interest of the media and other things, which brings me to the media. And here it seems to me the media has, in the main, in the first part of the Intifada, the first period of the Intifada, paid some attention, registered a few scenes, horrified and shocked American audiences with the brutality of Israeli soldiers, the bravery of Palestinian women and children. But by and large, I think the recession, the erosion that I was talking about earlier in attention and interest has taken over. And the media has now become a place, by and large, I'm talking about mainstream media. There are exceptions. One can always find, and this is part of the change in this country, there are alternative places that one can locate such things as analyses of what is taking place, in-depth portraits of Palestinian life, suggesting, in fact, the already present set of institutions and national traditions preparatory to independence and self-determination. But by and large, the role of the media in the present circumstances of, in fact, relegating the Intifada to a sort of back page item is, I think, scandalous. I would also want to suggests that the television has now abandoned what is taking place on the West Bank and Gaza. And I think there the convenient phrase, that is to say that we do this because when you press them, well, we're afraid, you know, that the Zionist lobby might do this, that, and the other thing is really not accurate, because I think the change in public mood requires from the media a closer attention to what is taking place. And more important than that, and this is what I'm trying to get at, it's not a question of showing scenes, you know, the horrific scenes that we were accustomed to in the first few months of 1988, but rather, and this is where I think the media fails abysmally, to connect those scenes with two other things, that is to say, the support of the United States for the Israeli occupation, which is continuous, and second, to connect those scenes with the changes, the important changes in Palestinian political rhetoric and discourse that have taken place momentously since November of 1988, sorry. Perhaps the most eloquent symbol of this is that, by and large, the voices of the Intifada, because here we're talking about an authentic expression of Palestinian national life, the voices of the Intifada, the voices of people in the end, because I was talking earlier about the dehumanization and the delegitimization of Palestinian political life, both culturally and politically, in Israel and in this country. The voices of people, the narrative of the Palestinian struggle has not been given a place in the current representation of the scene. And this, I think, is one of the greatest failings of the establishment media in this country. The third point to be made, and here I think I must talk a little bit more closer to home about the Arab situation, commented on, I think, by several of the panelists at this conference. That is to say, it seems to me that the Arab situation is parlous. I think the environment is not hospitable to the kinds of changes that, for example, were talked about on the last panel by George Abed, Laurie Brand, and Valerie York. That is to say, the emergence of a stronger and stronger religious voice, which, as one encounters it, is proposing a theocratic alternative to the secular and nationalist alternatives so far represented at the very center of Palestinian political life. The danger of the theocratic alternative, of course, is that it threatens to replace one theocracy with another. And I think it behooves every Palestinian, therefore, to comment on the extreme irony of a situation in which we say that we oppose the domination and the and the persecution that have been inflicted upon us by a people that suggests that it is a chosen people, etc., that is doing things with a mandate that is in part, if not exclusively, religious. The irony is that we're fighting that and perhaps thinking of replacing that with another theocratical alternative, which, in my opinion, would be equally, if not worse, equally bad, if not worse. But one of the salutary things about the Intifada is the extent to which its lessons, the lessons are essentially of popular empowerment, that people needn't accept a frozen status quo, that they can, using what is closest to hand, their own hands, the soil and rocks of their own earth, they can oppose unjust and tyrannical government. The example of the Intifada has spread throughout the Arab world. I need only mention the names of Jordan, Algeria, Tunisia, and Egypt to note the extent to which the lesson of the Intifada is spreading. And of course, with it spreads the fears of popular movement, fears held and entertained in the minds of largely unpopular regimes. I think also the present situation in the territories, as they affect the Arab world, lay upon us as Palestinians the need, and here once again I want to allude to the panel that preceded this session, lay upon us the need to think creatively, for the first time perhaps in the modern history of the Arab world, to think creatively about borders and about states. Most of the states in the area are, of course, as everyone knows and has been commented on many times, most of the states in the area are legacies of the era of colonialism. A Palestinian state that will come into being as a result largely of popular struggle. That's the only way it can come into existence. It can't come in brokered as a deal. It will come because people have struggled for it and have made it the inevitable, the irresistible, the irredeemable choice politically for the people. It will come into being, therefore, for the first time in the Middle East as a result of a massive popular struggle, and therefore, it seems to me one of the first things that, and we're thinking about it now, obviously, is how to think creatively and originally and authentically about what borders are, what states are. Need they always be impermeable? Need borders be things to confine and punish people, to prevent immigration in or out? Need states be apparatuses for the domination of people? Or can they be something else? Can they be, again on the model of the Intifada, can they be self-teaching? Can they be essentially classrooms for a people? I think there again the Intifada has in it the potential for an extraordinary model. Of course, it depends how you read it. If you think it's just one vast gambit to shift power from one group to another and use the new group to dominate another group, then I think you're misreading it. But I think if it can be read as, in fact, a tremendous experiment in self-education, and in fact, as something that has broken the mold, there's a wonderful early article, newspaper article by the Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci, which is called The Revolution Against Das Kapital, in which he discusses the October Revolution in Russia as a revolution that, in fact, went against Marx's Das Kapital. He said the interesting thing about great books like Das Kapital is that they seem to suggest a pattern for the way history and events might unfold. But he said the October Revolution was not exactly a disproof of it. The article is called The Revolution Against Das Kapital. He says that when history, in fact, begins to unfold, it can also be interpreted as a kind of criticism or disproving of some pattern that has been established, even that of Marx, in a Bolshevik revolution. I think the Intifada is like that. That is to say, I think the Intifada most probably is going against the received ideas and thought of, certainly of Palestinians, for the most part, but certainly of everyone else. It does seem to me, therefore, extraordinarily important to seize upon the Intifada, not as preparing the way for the future, but the Intifada is the future. That is to say, to think that the struggle for the future is sometime in the future is, I think, wrong. The future is now. And finally, I want to say something about the particular moment in which politically and culturally and intellectually we find ourselves in the United States. The discussion, as you know, has been, and the new buzzword or phrase has been, the peace process. And in fact, I think all Palestinians are extremely uncomfortable with what is now taking place publicly with regard to the question of Palestine. I refer specifically to what seem to be a series of, well, depending on how you look at it, indecent capitulations, tanazulat. The pressure on Yasser Arafat, given the utterly frozen official Israeli position, the pressure on Arafat to take one new position, daring position, avant-garde position, humiliating position, depending on how you look at it, after another. The recent flap in France over the National Covenant is a perfect case in point, but the discomfort started for us, obviously, in Geneva in December. But there, I think it depends on how you look at it. I mean, if you look at it as a series of betrayals, then, you know, we have started down the slippery slope and there's no end to it. On the other hand, if you think of it as a series of tests that we are submitting ourselves to as a way of provoking others to force the same tests on the other partner, namely the Israelis, then I think it's an interesting, even a magisterially interesting experiment. Because I read it, even if I feel uncomfortable about it, as I do, I read it as Arafat saying, okay, here's what I propose, and here's what I propose tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day. This seems to me to be the profoundest and the most interesting kind of provocation, publicly, to force the Israelis to do the same thing. Now, it's up to us, it seems to me, as Palestinian supporters, as intellectuals, as people who are committed to the program of the PNC in November, to further this. And therefore, I would say that what we should do in the light of that is not only to feel badly, we feel badly, of course, we all must say, and I want to say this right away, we all must say that at some point we've got to stop, submitting to the test. Say, okay, we hear all of these positions, they're out on the table, now we're stopping. But in the meantime, we're going on. It therefore should be incumbent upon us to provoke this public sphere in which all of this is taking place. Don't forget, it's not taking place in Palestine, it's taking place in France, it's taking place in Bulgaria, it's taking place in various parts of the Arab world. We say now the time has come, and I would like to give you an example of what I'm talking about. Now the time has come to say, publicly, Arafat has said he wants a peace conference, he wants 2 states, he wants 242, he wants 181. What is the Israeli record? And here's one of the great failings of the press. It hasn't done the same thing. I'll give you as an instance. This front page article by the New York Times a couple of days ago by Robert Peer, I think his name is Peer, in which he talks about all the contradictory comments made by various PLO people. I think the time has come to look, for example, at the Israeli record, which, at least in the case of Shamir, ought to be held up alongside the Palestinian record, remembering at the same time that the Palestinian position, the Palestinian situation is not the same. It's asymmetrical. It's not the same as the Israeli position. That Shamir has made every effort to remain a hardliner. I give you a couple of recent articles that appeared again in the Israeli press. One by Danny Rabinowitz in Haaretz, February 17th, 1989. One would wish that such articles or such information would get into the American press. It's certainly there in the Israeli press, in which Shamir is described as being diligent in strengthening the Israeli rejection front. And then he goes on to describe what his positions are, that they remain that of a man, according to another article in Haaretz by Uzi Benziman, a man who refuses to change. You see, I mean, you could show, as I say, Chairman Arafat's or President Arafat's positions as, in fact, establishing the fact of change in the Palestinian political, which he's exposing to the world at large, and test me on them. And the United States and the media is going on testing him relentlessly. Some of us feel perhaps indecently. But now, apply that scrutiny to Shamir as it appears even in the Israeli press, and you'll notice the relentless, unchanging quality of that this is a man committed to no change, and largely because, in fact, the administration, the public sphere in this country upon which Israel depends almost totally, has exonerated him. This is a man who, according to the Israeli press, is a rigid and suspicious man, who sees the Palestinian intifada as not a struggle for national liberation, but rather a new aspect of the general and ancient Arab plot to destroy Israel and exterminate its Jews. Along with this, he believes that Israeli Arabs present a potential danger to Israel's existence. And he goes on to say that even Egypt cannot be excluded from the Arab camp which is hostile to Israel, and on and on. I mean, this is a 5 single-space page article, which is hair-raising in its implications for the present, but perhaps more, and I want to conclude with this, more sinister than this, given the tremendous attempt and the tremendous interest and tremendous focus of the media on the Charter, on the Palestinian National Covenant, is Shamir's undying refusal to change his allegiance, his obligation to the principles of the Stern Gang, the Lehi, which he has been a member of and which are worthy of some attention. I quote now from the principles of Lehi, to which Shamir subscribes, or at least he hasn't said he doesn't subscribe to it. The homeland is the land of Israel within the borders given in the Torah. Unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. This is the land of life, where the entire Hebrew nation will reside in security. Israel conquered the land of Israel by the sword. There it became a nation, only there will it be able to undergo a renaissance. Hence the Jews alone have a right to the land of Israel. This right is incontestable. It did not expire and can never expire. Alliances should be formed with anyone who has an interest in the organization's war, this is of Lehi, and who are ready to give it direct help. The conquest of the homeland by force from aliens for perpetuity is considered the right of conquest. The renewal of Hebrew mastership over the land of redemption. The problem of aliens will be solved by population exchange. The aggrandizement of the Hebrew nation into a political, military, cultural, and economic power of the first rank in the East and on all the shores of the Mediterranean. Finally, the construction of the third temple, which is in Haram al-Sharif, as a symbol in the process of total redemption. Now, I say, why not ask Shamir about these principles at the same time that you're asking Yasser Arafat about the PNC resolutions and the covenant? I'm not saying that all Israel believes this, but this man, who is the elected prime minister of Israel, may or may not be part of this notion, but he hasn't dissociated himself from it. So I would say, therefore, the most urgent imperative of the present moment in the so-called discussion of the peace process in which all of us participate in this country, one way or another, is to elevate the discussion of principles and language and interpretation and resolutions and doctrine and ideology and future visions and all of that to a level of parity. Ask of us what you want, as indeed you are asking. You are asking to test us, to say, do you really mean what you say when you say you want two states and so on and so forth? Fine. But why not do the same thing to the Israelis? Ask them what it is that they want. What are their plans for the Palestinians? Besides saying, well, 10 years of Camp David down into the future, we'll talk about it later on, that kind of thing. What is your immediate position on such things as the land of Israel is entirely that for the Jews, and no aliens can be tolerated, they have to be thrown out by population? I'm not talking about Meir Kahane, I'm not talking about the principles of the party, of the group to which Shamir himself belongs. Why not, therefore, open the discussion to include this kind of thing, because it's taking place in the public sphere? That and increased pressure upon the United States government in its acts of complicity, or for its acts of complicity with the Israeli occupation, strike me as necessary to move the current impasse, because it is an impasse, off dead center. I want to suggest, therefore, that we mustn't be fooled into believing that the PLO-USA dialogue is going anywhere right now. I think it isn't. I think it's frozen. I think the changes are minuscule and hardly worth mentioning. The level of dialogue is not one of great substance. But that what is therefore important in this political arena here, to elevate the discussion, to propel it forward, and to think critically and courageously beyond the present impasse. I think, once again, the Intifada provides many models for that kind of thinking, and I believe it's upon us to develop them and push them forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now take just a few minutes of questions or brief comments for Idwārd Saʿīd, and if you'll go up to the microphone as Professor Mallison is already, and you may begin, please.
I would like to congratulate you, Edward, on your reference to complicity. This is a well-known legal concept in both international and domestic criminal law. when you speak of Israeli violations of human rights, you're largely speaking of violations of the Geneva Civilians Convention of 1949, which specifies in great detail what can and cannot be done to an occupied population. This convention is a treaty of the United States, therefore it is part of the supreme law of the land under Article 6 of our Constitution. And the United States, by being in complicity, being an accessory to violations of law, is equally guilty with the government of Israel. I think this is a point that Americans should make with our own government. Thank you for raising this important point.
Yes, if you'd please identify yourself and then ask.
My name is Swain Wood. I'm a Georgetown student. I was wondering if you would be willing to venture any explanation for why the American mainstream, mainline press has been so negligent in extending the discussion of the intifada to the American collusion or whatever
Yes.
with the Israelis.
Well, I think three reasons. One, power. I mean, the American press is, largely speaking, not an independent press as it pretends, but it follows the contours of government policy. Of course, there are exceptions. I think, by the way, radio is an exception. I mean, NPR is infinitely better than any of the networks. But by and large, most of the mainstream newspapers and networks think of themselves as embroidery on the official policy of the United States government. The paradigms, as sociologists of knowledge say, the paradigms are provided by U.S. policy. And if U.S. policy has decided that the intifada is X and Y and Z, then the networks more or less follow along as X and Y and Z. That is to say, at first it was humanitarian, there was a humanitarian interest, these are people being beaten up, throwing stones for it, etc. They will follow it. If then the next question is a question of law and order and we're against a Palestinian state, then the media pretty much follows it. There is a change here and there. There's a new respect given to Palestinian political pronouncements. But by and large, if you take the example of the whole notion of elections that the Israelis have put forward, the media accepts the agenda set for it by the policymakers, who in turn accept the agenda set for it by the Israelis. So there's a pattern of coziness there, which has to do with power and let's say, conjunctions of political power. The second reason, I think, is laziness. Most journalists will tend, in fact, to copy each other. It's astonishing that you will read and indeed see items on the network news which are carbon copies, not even good carbon copies, of some original that, you know. So I think that has a lot to do with it. And you'll also be surprised to know that most journalists, certainly American journalists dealing with the Middle East, have no background to speak of. This is quite different from the European and perhaps other parts of the world tradition, where people acquire some knowledge and experience and remain on the job and follow a situation or a region of the world more or less continually. Here, journalists become experts in a matter of days. They're flown in and out, and don't forget that the foreign news, by and large, is not glamorous here. I mean, of course, perestroika is, glasnost is, you know, but I'm talking about large swatches of the world that are simply not covered. Africa, the Indian subcontinent, they're simply not covered in the U.S. press. They're thought of as sort of uninteresting and not sexy. So laziness plays a very important role. And I think a third reason is you know, I think in many respects the nature of, in particular, television. That is to say, I'm not talking about an institutional and even ideological fact about them, that if you conceive of the whole news of the world, a large part of which is the United States, as compressible into 22 minutes in an evening, and even if you're as clever as Peter Jennings and Brokaw and who's the other one? I can't remember his name. Anyway, you can't reduce the world that quickly. So there is a necessary falsification that takes place, and it becomes even more glaringly ideological given the pressures to fit the news of the world into 22 minutes. I suppose a fourth reason is the lack of a deterrent. That is to say, there are many people, and I travel around a great deal, I'm sure Michael does too, in the country. There's a tremendous hunger, I've found, everywhere in the United States for more news. People say, well, this is not being covered. Everywhere I go, people say that. Of course, this position is largely unorganized. You know, people in Iowa and New Mexico and Florida and Utah, you know, but there isn't the whole network is not there. But I suspect that the changes are slow in coming and slow in taking effect, but I think they will begin to affect at least local news outlets who are beginning to be responsive to different points of view. But in the meantime, I think we have to continue very harsh pressure on local news services, local stations and so on, and, you know, make a different point of view heard. For example, I'll give you an instance right now, is this whole question which Tony Lewis had a piece on in the Times yesterday or today, this attempt by PBS not to show a film about the Palestinians because it didn't have anything about the Holocaust in it, or, you know, it was unbalanced, or I forget the reasons given, but that was one of them. No, I'm right, aren't I? Did you see the article? Right. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed it. Well, had I been here, I'd have seen it. Yeah, right. But in any event, now that, it seems to me, is an extraordinarily important opportunity to organize locally. That is to say, who is this creature who says that you can't show a film about Palestinians because it doesn't show all of the, it's not balanced. Whereas, as Tony Lewis says, the First Amendment is not about balance. It's about having a point of view, and we're really talking about thought control, we're talking about censorship on the part of a few well-placed individuals in the media. That is very frequent, and it can be addressed. We've been talking about it for years. So I think that's a rapid analysis of the situation.
A very good one.
Hi, my name is George Shadroy. I'm a graduate student at Georgetown. I used to be a journalist, but I'm not anymore, I'm happy to say.
No, not all journalists are bad. I mean, there's some very good ones. I mean, Neff, whom I don't know is very good, Alex Coburn, Hitchens, etc. There are a number of them, of course. But they're not mainstream journalists, that's the point.
My question is basically that you're suggesting, I think, that there's an agenda that needs to be pursued not only in the occupied territories, but in the United States, right, by those people who are concerned about this particular issue. Do you have a program of suggestions that might enable people to kind of infiltrate or permeate this kind of mindset that politically this country seems to be stuck in? I'll give you an example.
Yes. An
exception, actually, that might be a hopeful sign, and that's the other night I saw Pat Buchanan and Tom Brading attacking in a polemical way Benjamin Netanyahu on the fact that he could not put forward a counter-proposal on Israel's side to the Namibian proposal that Arafat was making. I personally agree with you. I don't see anything wrong with Arafat doing that because he's staying on the offensive as opposed to being on the defensive.
Right.
Do you have any? Is there any way to infiltrate or to change that psyche? Given after all this time of the Intifada, it hasn't changed yet.
No, it has. I mean, I think it has changed. I mean, I think the seeds of change are there. I think, it's difficult to pronounce or to sort of spin out a program, as you call it, other than to say, I mean, acts of initiative have to be taken. Now, the facts are as follows. There are very few Palestinians in this country, relatively speaking. I mean, it's a tiny minority. The organizations are largely, well, I mean, to use the word primitive is perhaps to give them too much credit. They're beginning to emerge. So I don't think one can depend on that. But I certainly think that linking various issues to the Palestinian question, intellectual and political issues to the Palestinian question, are quite the way to proceed. I mean, there are issues on campuses. First of all, find a site that you can work in. I mean, certainly a university is one. I mean, the university is a privileged space, it's true, but it provides opportunities for making these kinds of connections in issues having to do, for example, with peace, anti-war, anti-nuclear platforms are plentiful. Human rights platforms are plentiful on the campuses. It seems to me that we have to show initiative in getting ourselves on those agendas. We've been largely quarantined, for perfectly obvious reasons. That has to begin. Second, I think there has to be a much more determined intellectual effort made to link not just the Intifada, but I mean the whole tenor, you might say, of Palestinian political existence with the vast interest that occurs in this country and elsewhere in other disadvantaged third world groups. I mean, black history. I mean, for example, one can find a great deal that is parallel and remarkably illuminating in the works, for example, of people like Du Bois, early early 20th century black thinkers in this country who face some of the problems of integration and separation that exists, for example, now in the West Bank and Gaza, let us say between whites and blacks, between Jews and Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. So, one has to widen the debate. That's the most that one can do. And then, obviously, on the governmental level, I would have thought too that the pressure on radios, on television, on local representatives in issues that have to do, as Professor Mallison was saying, that have to do with direct U.S. complicity. It's very hard for me to sleep at night thinking that the taxes that we pay are going into these damn rubber bullets and canes and tear gas canisters that are used by the Israeli force. They are. That's where they're going, a lot of them. I think a hastening of the sensitivity and sensibility that we have as citizens to this actual, it's not a remote thing. This reporter for the New York Times who won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, as Alex Coburn says, he won them at the expense of Palestinians. Tom Friedman, who is I don't want to get into him right now. I can go on about him at great length, but I won't. I'll spare you my Tom Friedman spiel. But anyway, he says, the thing about this is that, and he's really part of he is the problem, that he says that the thing is that the Intifada and the whole Palestinian movement now is not going to really make an impression on U.S. policymakers because he says it's there's no body count. Think of how racist that is. That the only bodies that count are American bodies or white bodies or Israeli bodies. But Palestinian bodies, and there are several hundred of them now, and many, many, many thousand of maimed, and even many more thousands of imprisoned, those have to make a difference. So, those are some of the issues that one would want to raise, but I don't think there's a program in the sense of some, thing that you could write down on a piece of paper. One of the funny things, by the way, it's just a thing that came to mind, that the Israeli media recently it's part of the business of focusing on the defeats of Israel in the Intifada, has written some articles about the so-called Palestinian propaganda effort in the United States, which they claim is brilliantly orchestrated and so on. Anybody who knows anything about Palestinian activity brilliant orchestration is not one of its mainly has said, there's this thing, and the Israelis are now, they're on the defensive, there's no question about it. But it's largely the effort of people in a decentralized way. As I say, I don't have a central program to put forward, but I think just pressing on these issues that bear upon people like you and me at universities and other sites of that kind, I think can make a great difference.
I think we'll take these 2 more questions. Yes, please.
Shaligram Shukla from Georgetown University. Well, I believe that it is an illusion to think that the Israel and the United States are 2 different entities. I think they are a continuation of the same thing with vast areas of darkness where most of the American people and perhaps press also live. I was surprised that I would like to also include England in the same category. It's a continuation of Israel. But you did not mention the third world countries where people are involved and thinking about it, and there might be some hope, some steps and thoughts and so on coming from that direction. What do you think of those people over there?
Look, I don't, in general, allow for the collapsing of distinctions. I think it's useful to somehow see things that are similar, to see them together. You say Israel and the United States are the same thing. I don't think they are the same thing. I think empirical common sense evidence tells us that they are, first of all, they're not monolithic. No, I didn't interrupt you. Let me just finish, if I may. I think that there are profound cleavages, rifts in both American and Israeli societies. There are what could be called conjunctural moments. There are moments in which they come together. Certainly, American political thinking over the last, or the Reagan period, has been to see that Israel is a strategic asset, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this isn't by no means to say that the whole situation is dominated by that conjunction. I think there are important segments of the society, both in Israel and in this country, that differ with this, and it's therefore important to make that distinction. I think it's terribly important to do that. In the second place, I don't mean to be, and I didn't mean to be invidious by not talking about the third world. I mean, the third world is, you know, a very large place. I mean, it includes most of Africa and Asia, all of Africa and Asia, and a good deal of Latin America. I think there too one has to make distinctions. I mean, and talk about the way in which independence movements and revolutions and liberation movements were hijacked, were shorn of their promise, were rendered parodistic replicas of the very regimes they were opposing. So to say the third world, for me, although I understand exactly the kind of emotional meaning of the phrase, is by no means a blanket approval of the third world. I mean, there are many things in the third world, including in the Arab world, which is part of the third world, that are horrific to contemplate and provide no model whatever. Now, if you were to tell me what parts of the third world, I'm not asking that you do that, but I mean, it's a rhetorical question. If you were to tell me what particular experiment or what particular social and political movement or cultural movement in the third world you had in mind, then perhaps we can talk about it. But to say the third world generally is to say, on one level, our experiences are those of the formerly colonized world. Yes, they are. Palestinians belong in the same world as Indians and Africans and Latin Americans who, over time, shed colonialism. But from then on, it's up for grabs, and it deeply depends on what Palestinians in the present moment are going to do about their own future that may or may not cause them to fall into a majority of patterns in the third world which are unpleasant and horrific to contemplate, or perhaps find new patterns for a Palestinian state. I deeply believe that that will be the case, but it's not a foregone conclusion by any means.
Thank you. And I think this will be the last question or comment, please.
My name is Tamam Al-Barazi. I am Washington correspondent for Al-Watan Al-Arabi magazine, a pan-Arab paper. I would like, you mentioned a lot the Israeli press and the American press. I would like you to comment on the Arab press, especially you write you have been writing in a Saudi paper. I haven't seen ever anybody criticizing Arafat for what he did, and there is no opposition to him in the Arab world. You know, my experience, I written a couple of lines, I've been suspended for 8 weeks for that. I mean, it's just, I want to know, is Arafat always right? I mean, where he will end his concession after concession. You know, he recognized Israel and he said, PNC recognized it. But I interviewed Abu Iyad after he said, no, we did not recognize Israel in the PNC meetings. So I wonder why there is no opposition. I mean, every opposition you call it, this is a client to Syria or agent to this or this.
I didn't say that.
I know. I mean, every in the Palestinian area. I mean, in the Arab world, you know, everybody who opposes Arafat is an agent to Syria or agent to this or that. Second question, you know, you always. Well,
I mean, let me just answer the first one.
No, it's very short. I mean, you always. You and your groups, you know, what we call Arab American, you know, here, is always say it's a Palestinian-Israeli fight. So you think you can achieve anything without the Arab masses? I know they are being oppressed in all these 22 Arab regimes, but you can't do anything of liberating Palestine without the Arab masses. So are you happy now you transfer the whole thing, Palestinian and Israeli conflict?
I mean, it sounds like a rather unfriendly series of comments. I'll take it that way. Look, you know, I mean, the Arab masses. Let's begin with them. No, I don't think that anything I said precludes the Arab masses. You know, I'm not sure that it's my role to issue invitations to join, but I think the evidence has been that the intifada, as interpreted by many Palestinians, is, of course, very popular in the Arab world. But the intifada was not largely, but to a very considerable degree, the effect of, in a general sense, Arab indifference. People have to conduct their own struggles. Now, I'm sure there are many feelings of solidarity and indeed many acts of participation on the part of other Arabs, masses or individuals, with the Palestinian struggle. And I am not enough of a politician or a political scientist to tell you what the exact mixture of Arab and Palestinian contributions to the settlement, the comprehensive settlement that we all talk about, will be. I have no way of telling you this, but I certainly don't mean to quarantine the struggle, but to focus on what to me is the most urgent part of it, that is to say the struggle between Palestinians and Israelis on the land of Palestine or the occupied territories or whatever you want to call it. But it seems to me there is a considerable intellectual, political, cultural reason for focusing on it. Yes, it has, in my mind, a priority. I didn't say that it excludes everything else, but it is a priority. Now, the second point, or rather the first point you made, which I will talk about second, is the question of criticism of Arafat. It seems to me that the Arab world, at least certainly the Syrian world, is full of criticism of Arafat. I've heard mostly criticism of Arafat. It doesn't seem to me, let me finish, then perhaps you can make another comment if you wish. But I don't think that everything that he does is right. I don't think that everything that anyone does is right. I think we're dealing, first of all, in a situation which is quite different from that of other leaders in the Arab world. The Palestinian movement is an extraterritorial movement. It has no state, it has no sovereignty at present. It has a state, a declared state, which is under occupation. So the situation of Arafat is very different, much more precarious, much more dangerous. He exists in a largely hostile environment, I would say largely hostile, not completely hostile, but largely hostile or treacherous environment in the Arab world. And I personally don't envy him. Having said that, I wouldn't go so far as to say that everything he does is right. You must not frequent many Palestinians, because if you do, most of what Palestinians talk about are the things that we're doing wrong. The mistakes that we've made. Must we do this? Look at what we've done there. Essentially, not pride in ourselves, but just the opposite. Palestinians are essentially complainers and critics. So I don't know what this idea that you have about this, and I think even it's of course a little much to expect in an official Palestinian press release to find criticism of the kind of the top boss. I don't know exactly what it is that you're referring to, therefore. It seems to me that you're talking about a state of mind, and that's the last point I want to make, and that is, I think Palestinians, and I think many Arabs, I think even you, if you were to look carefully into your own heart, are proud of what Palestinians are doing. This doesn't mean that they're not proud of what other Arabs are doing, but I think the intifada is qualitatively a different thing. It doesn't make it blessed, it doesn't make it, I never use the word blessed, but it's used quite often. I'm a secular person. But the point is that I think what we should try, and in my own comments, I connected the intifada with other movements in the Arab world, other popular movements, and I think that's where the issue really lies. I certainly, disclaim any cult of the leader or cult of the personality or kum il-sungism or any of that stuff. I think that he's a man, or all Palestinian leaders, in their contradictory voices and statements, reflect the natural national life of a people.
And on that note, I'd like to thank Idwārd Saʿīd. And I would also like to thank some other people before we adjourn. It's customary at the conclusion of a symposium at Georgetown. It's customary at the conclusion of a symposium at Georgetown to thank those that have worked very hard to make the program run smoothly. And I would like very quickly to thank, first of all, the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies Faculty Steering Committee, my co-chair, Dr. Seth Tillman, Hisham Sharabi, Halim Barakat, Judith Tucker, and Ibrahim. I'd like to give a very special word of thanks to our symposium manager, Anne-Marie Sharawi, who has organized all of the details of this. And to her special assistants on this project, Marty Reimer and Anita Fabos. We also have student volunteers that have worked hard on the symposium: Kim Cloudman, Olivia Stewart, Stephanie Turco among them. And then the rest of the CCAS staff, starting certainly with our Assistant Director, Mary McDavid, who has been working also night and day on this project, Nina Dodge, Michael Simpson, Marie Tuller, Maria Tyler, and our 3 work studies students, Abina Darka, Michelle Hicks, and Jennifer Watley. And with that, I declare the symposium adjourned and invite you to go upstairs for the cocktail reception.